I thought I would make a video on my top 10 games of 2023 so I could go into more detail. I'm not usually great at forming my thoughts into anything substantially long, and I'm especially not used to any kind of script. That said, I thought I'd give it a go just to see what diving into YouTube might be like for me. So before I start, I'll just say two things. One, the footage I'm using might not necessarily line up with what I'm talking about currently because I'm just grabbing trailers, gameplay footage, or just little bits and bobs I've recorded here and there. And the other thing, one of the games on this list has moved around from my Twitter list. I hadn't finished it at the time, I still haven't finished it, but I've grown to love it a lot more than I already did. So I've just moved that down, and that's why this is in a different position. So with that out of the way, let's dive in. It's safe to say 2023 has been one of the best years for game releases ever. It seems like we just keep getting amazing game after amazing game after amazing game with little to no breathing room. Whether or not these games will end up holding influences over the years like Half-Life 2 or Bioshock or so on, we'll see. I've took a long hard look at the stuff I've played this year and what I feel my top 10 are. To note, these aren't all FPS games, they're just my favourite games of the year, so let's check them out starting with number 10. Number 10, Ion Fury Aftershock. Ion Fury was one of the biggest games back in 2019 in the retro FPS scene, and it's one I enjoyed a lot. Built on the Build engine, it was meant to fit snugly into the original Build trilogy of games, Duke Nukem 3D, Shadow Warrior, and Blood. That said, it's clearly trying to emulate Duke Nukem 3D's vibe more than Shadow Warrior or Blood, which makes sense seeing as the protagonist, Shelly, was originally meant to be like a sidekick to Duke in Duke Nukem Forever, and the antagonist Dr. Heskel is voiced by John St. John, who is the voice of Duke Nukem. The level design is very much city focused, like a lot of Duke 3D was. The maps are significantly more detailed in Ion Fury than any of the original Build games, as it's using a modern updated version of Build, which allowed them to go a lot further with the maps. It's one of the most detailed cyberpunk cities you'll see in a game, but Ion Fury was a long game, and the same repeated aesthetics did eventually get tiring towards the end. So in comes Ion Fury Aftershock, which is releasing now 4 years after the original game. The premise starts off directly after the ending of Ion Fury, with long story short being that all your effort was for nothing, as Heskel's gotten away with everything, so now you're going back to fuck him up again. Aftershock introduces a few new additions, the most notable of which is a hoverbike vehicle that you get to ride for a good chunk of the game. I really enjoyed riding through levels on this thing. The first time you get to use it properly being in this sort of time trial level with a timer. You can jump and dash with the bike, and the propellers actually rip enemies up if you drive into them, which is a neat detail. The level design is an improvement over the original with some more interesting settings. You start off in a bar like the original, and then you eventually make your way into areas like a construction yard, a large shopping mall where you'll get the hoverbike, a canal, a graveyard, a volcano. There's also a new weapon in this expansion that you get from the bike after you're done with it. Ion Fury was lacking in any kind of truly powerful weapon you'd expect from a 90s style shooter. Doom had the BFG, Duke Nukem had the Devastator, Shadow Warrior had a nuke launcher, so on, and now you get this homing cannon which can rip through multiple enemies.
I've got a present for you.
Aftershock also adds in an arrange mode, which is a remix of the original Ion Fury campaign. The levels are mirrored, the new weapon is added into the campaign, new enemies are placed and shuffled around. I ended up preferring this version of the campaign over the original just for these new additions and the change to the final boss, which I won't spoil. Though it does add in these GDF enemies introduced in the Aftershock campaign, and they kind of mess with the story of the first campaign if you play it this way, though that's a very minor nitpick really, as it's not canon anyway. I'm not sure if I'm imagining it either, but the game felt a lot smoother in the animations. The weapons felt particularly nice to use now. I might be imagining it, but it felt great. So overall, I really liked Aftershock, and I hope they can turn Phantom Fury into something great. The demo didn't leave a great taste in my mouth, and now that it's delayed to 2024, they might be able to bump those issues out. Number 9, Alan Wake 2. I played through Alan Wake 1 in preparation for this game, and I enjoyed my time with it. It had a compelling story and it wasn't too long, but I think most people would agree that the combat got old and tedious well before the game finished. The narrative is what really carried that game. I'd say the same for Alan Wake 2, but more so. Alan Wake 2 is a much slower burn than the first game, and combat is barely a part of the game overall, for better or worse. Remedy described Alan Wake 2 as a survival horror game, but their take on it. While mechanically it does fit the bill as a survival horror, I'd say it doesn't really succeed on delivering a great one, as like I said, combat and just even threats in general are mostly a non-aspect of the game. For a lot of the opening hours, you're really just exploring these condensed areas, gathering various clues and then lining them up all together to solve various story threads. And this is all fine and dandy on a first playthrough, but a lot of these these clues are things you will have figured out well in advance, while Saga, one of the two protagonists, is just repeating stuff you already know. I did like this system, but it is something you have to actively engage in a lot of the time to progress the game, which is a bit annoying. Alan's sections are a lot different to Saga's. You're exploring this alternate version of New York, also a mostly small and condensed area, but packed with detail. There are these threats around the place, these kind of shadow people. They walk around muttering various things, including creepily saying Alan's name. The gist of these guys is that you aren't really going to know which ones are enemies and which ones are there to just put you on edge. And it's effective at that, but you'll quickly discover that the vast majority of these guys are just not really an issue, and any that you think might be, you can just shine your flashlight on them and they'll disappear. When you do get into combat, it is fun. Some enemies are pretty creepy looking, like this one enemy that's mirrored underneath from the torso down. The weapon sounds, just like Alan Wake 1, are also really good and satisfying. The dodge move is still essential to not getting whacked in the face by a hatchet. You get a lot of resources to pick up and stash in your Resident Evil style box and your Resident Evil style safe room. But I had to go out of my way to actively use these items, as there was just rarely any occasion I felt like I had to use my items, even on hard mode. Now, it might sound like I'm shitting on the game, which I guess I am at the moment, but in comes the part that really captivated me. The narrative and aesthetic presentation of the game. The story did a great job of keeping me engaged start to finish, and while there were certainly aspects I didn't like, the game never bored me for a second. Some of the areas in the game are downright gorgeous, some of the best visuals I've ever seen in a game. Alan's New York sections are a particular highlight, with some amazing uses of colored lighting and atmospheric rain. Though, as with many amazing looking games with rain, they never seem to be able to match the intensity of the rain with the sounds, either being too loud or too quiet and not matching the amount of rain around you. It might sound like a small thing, but I find rain to be a very important effect to get right, since we all know what heavy rain should sound like, and when it doesn't sound like that, it's constantly taking me out. Alan Wake 2 also includes Remedy's now signature live action moments, and I'd say this is easily the peak of them. There's many areas where these are used. For example, you might be going down a corridor and it will overlay a ghostly version of a real location over the screen, which makes this really trippy transition effect that looked cool every time. Alan has many sections in live action, and in these you'll really just be sitting down watching a short video of him on a TV show or even a multi-stage rock opera musical. These parts never got old and they were filmed really well. So on a gameplay level, I didn't quite feel like it had enough to offer, basically being the opposite to Alan Wake 1, but everything else was so compelling it still managed to end up on my top 10 list. Hopefully the Nightmare difficulty, New Game Plus and any DLCs will fix the combat issues I have. Number 8, Dead Space Remake. I think everyone can agree Dead Space didn't really need a remake. The only thing aged about that game was the fact that Isaac didn't speak while he did in 2 and 3, which made it a little jarring to go between them. But other than that, it didn't need a remake. But that said, the Dead Space remake is really awesome. From the get-go, you'll see just how gorgeous this remake is, and the characters are rewritten a little to make them more likeable than they were originally. Everyone's a little less pissed off at each other from the start. I have to get this out of the way though. The PC version of the game for me and many others was horrendous. The performance was good all the way through, but it was ruined by a constant stuttering issue that would happen as you make your way through the Ishimura. This issue is made 10 times worse when you do any kind of backtracking, as you're sprinting through the Ishimura and stuttering basically every second. It sucks, and Motive and EA completely abandoned this game way back in February, and it seems like they're never going to fix it. Eventually I just got it on PS5 and finished it recently, and yeah, I love it. I mentioned backtracking a minute ago, and this is something new to the remake. Instead of each chapter being broken up by the tram system, instead trams are more of a fast travel option now, and you'll seamlessly make your way through the Ishimura through newly added areas. Backtracking will be a big focus of the game if you want to get the meat out of it, as there's now side quests. These are really just narrative treats usually, but I appreciate them nonetheless at fleshing out the lore and world around you. Weapons are now found in the environment naturally instead of appearing in the store, which was a nice change. The alt fires on some of them are changed also. The ridiculous but awesome 360 firing mode on the pulse rifle is now replaced with a proximity mine, which is far more useful but far less awesome, I guess. The flamethrower can also put up a flame wall in front of you, which proved useful, and there's other changes to weapons too. The plasma cutter has an upgrade that lets you bitch slap necromorphs to the ground, which is always really funny. The sounds of the weapons are arguably less punchy than the original, which is a shame, but are still good. Weapons now also rip through enemies' flesh and bone in a gruesome but satisfying addition. This lets you see how much damage you're really doing to enemies, and with the force gun specifically, blasting an enemy with it will literally rip all the skin off them instantly, which is horrifying. The zero gravity sections are now more like Dead Space 2's, with you being able to freely move around in them rather than jump from surface to surface, which was cool. Though a lack of up and down maneuverability in them made getting around a little confusing. Instead you have to position yourself yourself towards whatever you want to go to and then you just fly towards it. The Dead Space remake doesn't really do anything outstanding better that the original didn't already do well, so it does make its position on here a little iffy, but nonetheless I really like this remake and I do hope Motive get to work on remaking 2 and especially 3 into something better in the future, just this time with a better PC port. Number 7. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. I'm throwing Phantom Liberty in here, but really this is making the list mostly because the 2.0 update exists. I always enjoyed Cyberpunk 2077 from the start, but I was severely let down in a lot of aspects. The cyberware and the skill system is really the big ones. The 2.0 update, which dropped a few days prior to the Phantom Liberty expansion, overhauled and added a few systems, most notably completely overhauling the skill tree from top to bottom. They also removed armor being tied to clothing and put that on cyberware instead, with cyberware also now having a limit to how much you can equip at once. As you level up, you'll be able to equip more, and there's even a perk that lets you go beyond your limit in exchange for going cyber psycho at times, though this isn't really much of a negative. The police system was overhauled into something more like Grand Theft Autos, and they also added vehicle combat, though this isn't actually as exciting as it sounds, as outside of getting police on you intentionally, you'll almost never get into a situation where you'll be fighting enemies in a vehicle. There are new side missions in Phantom Liberty that involve you stealing cars and delivering them elsewhere, and it feels like these exist purely to make the new vehicle combat system worth even having in the game, as you'll have random enemies chase you doing these. The vehicle combat is fun, but it'll likely be a lot more interesting in the Cyberpunk sequel, where it can be built around from the get-go. The skill tree overhaul is the most exciting part of 2.0 though. No longer are skills a disjointed mess of insignificant percentage buff, but skills that synergize with one another, and they let you craft your own unique build. I went for a berserk cyberware build with melee and pistols as my go-to, and I had a great time slicing dudes up. The Phantom Liberty expansion is also really good, with the best storytelling the game has had. You work as a sort of agent for the government in this one, constantly wondering who you can actually trust and rely on and who you want to side with. There's many twists in this storyline, and there are choices that genuinely impact the outcome you'll get. Dogtown, the new location, is relatively small, but it's full of detail, and it has its own unique look separate from the main location. I can't talk much about Phantom Liberty without spoiling it, so I'll just say if you enjoyed the story in Cyberpunk, you'll likely love the story and quest Phantom Liberty has to offer. Finally, Cyberpunk is the game it should have been at launch. Number 6. RoboCop Rogue City. If you told me a year ago that Teon, the makers of the god-awful Rambo the video game, and the surprisingly decent Terminator Resistance would make one of the best shooters of 2023, I'd probably call you a liar. Yet, here we are. RoboCop Rogue City easily has some of the most satisfying weaponry, gore, and environmental destruction in a video game since the original Fear back in 2005. Any clip of this game in action should really sell you on it. Your movement is kind of slow as you'd expect RoboCop to be, but you hit like a freight train. Your Auto 9 pistol makes heads pop like balloons and their brains get sent all over the walls behind them. You can pick up and hurl objects at enemies, or even pick up enemies and throw them at other enemies. It never gets old, and it kind of reminds me of messing around with the gravity gun in Half-Life 2. Your Auto 9 pistol gets various circuit boards you can customize with percentage nodes. They give you different buffs or negatives like reload speed, damage, or even just stupid shit like making the gun give more gore effects. There's no other benefit to that. It just makes combat more gory. There's a hub city you can explore a few times in the game. It's sort of like a light Deus Ex, doing various side activities and talking to NPCs. I think some of the conversations even have skill checks that you can't pass if you don't have the right skill. A lot of the dialogue is also really funny.
I got something for you, officer. I know where you can find a wanted criminal. That poster over there says there's a reward for that information, and I want it.
I want details.
Are you blind? I'm the guy from that poster, so here I am. Now, give me the money.
I will have to detain you.
Fine, but I still get the reward, right?
No.
Graphically, the game looks amazing. It runs on Unreal Engine 5, and the environments can look near photorealistic at times, with small details like papers blowing around in the wind, broken bins and litter all over the floor. Character models are a bit more mixed. They look notably less detailed than the environments, and they suffer even worse on the animations, with some lip syncing that shows that Half-Life 2 is still ahead of the game. I can give a pass to it because I'm not coming to RoboCop for state-of-the-art lip syncing technology, but I hope Teon can improve on that in future games. Also, somebody please give Teon the license to Die Hard or Judge Dredd or John Wick. These guys clearly know how to make a good movie game by now. Number 5. Amnesia the Bunker. Amnesia the Bunker is easily Frictional Games' best work they've done yet on a gameplay front. It takes place in a French World War I bunker where you're trapped alone with an unkillable monster. The game is uniquely an immersive sim-style survival horror, and it's easily the best survival horror of the year. You get a gun very early on, but don't expect to go around blasting fools with it. It's more of a last resort or a tool used to do other actions. Soon after, you'll get to the safe room, which has a lamp used for saving, and there are only 2 of these in the game, and this is the only one you'll use regularly. There's also a generator that is powered by fuel cans around the bunker to keep the lights on. The bunker is divided into several subsections where you'll go around trying to find different tools to access other parts of the bunker, or finding dog tags that let you open up lockers for extra goodies or helpful items. In a dick move, some dog tags will have no code on the back, having you use valuable resources just to be basically trolled. Not that that's a bad thing. Roaming the bunker is this monster that stalks your every move. Sounds you make will bring it nearby and force you to either move about cautiously or make sure you have items on you to defend yourself with. Your flashlight, for example, has a pull cord that makes a lot of noise when you use it, so deciding when and where to use it is one of many things you have to think about. There are also various hazards such as mutant rats in the way eating corpses. You can get around them in various ways, like throwing a grenade at them to kill them, burning the corpse to permanently keep them away, or even just risking it and running by them, though you'll get bitten and take damage which has to be bandaged up later. The bunker also features randomized elements every playthrough, such as dog tag codes being random or traps in different places. It keeps the game fresh every time. What really cements the bunker as part of my top 10 is the recent Halloween update. It adds a wealth of various options to customize your playthrough. A lot of sliders or optional challenges like adding more or less traps, making a monster resilient to bullets, locking the gun behind a locker which means you're even more defenseless until you can find it, moving several lockers to other areas, or even adding in fuse boxes which now require fuses to power subsections. These changes make the game's randomization even more interesting and can make the game significantly more challenging than before. There are so many options here, I'd be surprised if you can get bored of it. I really hope Frictional continue to go this way with their games, more of a mechanical focus and emphasis on the survival horror elements. Number 4, Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon. Armored Core 6 is the long-awaited return of From Software's actual flagship series Armored Core, and was it worth the wait? Yes. It's not as ball-crushingly difficult as most of their recent titles, and it's especially nowhere near as hair-rippingly difficult as Armored Core Last Raven, but it's easily the most fun I've had with the series. From Software finally have the budget to build a very detailed mech game, and every action you perform feels really smooth. They bring in their expertise in making bosses feel cool as hell to fight, and there was a boss near the end of the first chapter that did take me a few hours. The most surprising part of Armored Core 6 for me was how engaging the story was. You'll never see a character's face at all, yet the entire main cast are all extremely well written and voice acted. Handler Walter in particular was one of my favourites, and of course everyone's favourite waifu Aya. To get the full story, you'll actually have to play through the game 3 times, which I thought would get old, but the story really grabbed me enough to see it through to the end, and I'm glad I did, as the true ending ends with this really great song with broken English vocals that gave me goosebumps. I hope From Software plans to make more Armored Core games again and soon, maybe even some DLC for 6. As it is though, Armored Core 6 is a fantastic return to form. Number 3, System Shock Remake. I'm not going to bother with going into the development history of this one. Yes, it took many years, many more years than it should, but it's finally here, and it's really good. The biggest strength System Shock displays off the bat is how amazing the game's aesthetic choices are. There's a lot of vibrant colours on display and a faithfulness to the original's level design that almost gives the game a surreal kind of vibe. The original thumping or headache-inducing soundtrack, depending on which way you swing, has been replaced with a more atmospheric soundtrack, reminiscent of 2017's Prey. As mentioned before, the level design stays pretty faithful to the original, though with some changes here and there to make the station feel more like it makes sense. Getting around the environment has using a lot of doors, and they show Night Dive's clear attention to detail with the various ways these doors open and close. Hallways are also filled with different lights, monitors, creatures, robots, and cyborgs. Combat plays mostly standard to modern FPS games. You shoot a thing until it dies, and that's perfectly serviceable. Enemies tend to have pretty predictable behaviour, which is a bit lame, but they also do pack a punch and kill you pretty easily if you're underestimating them or not using cover correctly. Enemies can explode in a shower of gore when grenades are thrown, or when you whack their heads off with a wrench. Weapon upgrades are now a thing. There's recyclers around the environment where you can dump random crap you found from the environment in exchange for coins. Coins that you can either then buy ammo with, snacks, or, as mentioned, upgrades for your weapon. This adds in some nice progression to the game to keep weapons feeling fresh throughout your playthrough. The inventory is now more in line with System Shock 2's, with a set grid space that can be upgraded by half a row twice with items found later. You'll end up picking a lot of stuff up to exchange for credits, but most people find it easy to just turn these items into scrap as they take up a lot less space, though they also yield less credits in return. Annoyingly, you have to right-click every individual item you want to turn into scrap, instead of there being any kind of mass scrap option. It's not the worst thing, but you spend a lot of time just repeatedly right-clicking in your inventory, and they really could streamline it in the future. The game doesn't hold your hand at any point either, just like the original. You're expected to memorize or note down important locations and objectives, finding out what to do from audio and text logs, and this might be an issue for some who are used to more modern game design sensibilities, but I enjoyed the challenge of figuring out what to do on my own and accomplishing those goals. Terry Brosius returns as the voice of Shodan, and she knocks it out of the park once again. She has a bit of a deeper, more mature voice since it has been 20 years since the last System Shock, but it still remains really threatening. I do wish they would have leaned a bit more into her creepier and threatening demeanor that she displays in the sequel, but I don't really have many complaints about this. My only major issue with the game is the final boss and the ending. The final boss is just objectively awful and it feels completely unfinished. The ending is also really unsatisfying and over with quickly with this terrible song playing over it. Both of these are supposedly set to be overhauled with a big update in the future, so I hope these will fix those issues with the game. Number 2, Resident Evil 4 Remake. While the Dead Space remake doesn't change much significantly from its original game, Resident Evil 4 overhauls and does its own take on almost every aspect from the original Resident Evil 4, and for the most part I'd say it does them much better. I'd say the Resident Evil 4 remake is now arguably the best game in the entire series, with the most enjoyable combat yet, continuing on from RE2 remakes Leon and showing him as deeply affected by the events of Raccoon City, where he now wants to do things right this time. You'll notice straight away the darker tone RE4 takes over the original, one you'll either prefer or you won't. For me it wasn't a matter of objectivity, but the way the game changes itself up. The forest is darker and creepier, the first house is bigger and has more of a build up to the first enemy encounter, the village fight is more brutal and challenging. Everything feels amped up over the original. Your knife now gets a parry that you can perform at the last second of an incoming attack. It drains your knife's durability, so it can't be used to get out of every situation, and stunning enemies takes more shots to compensate for the ability to move and shoot at the same time now. The combat feels far more engaging over the original, and the great sound design and gore makes it feel a lot more satisfying. Graphically, RE Engine delivers once again, and the game runs smoothly outside of one brief section and some heavy rain. Most people would say the original game loses steam by the island section, and I tend to agree. This section is much better in the remake, and the Krauser fight specifically is overhauled into this Metal Gear Solid style one-on-one, with knives that you actually get to use instead of QuickTime events now, and this never got old no matter how much I replayed it. The bosses in general are just a step above the original this time, and they're that much more exciting. Capcom proves once again, excluding RE3, how to do a good remake, and if they remake RE5, I'll be really excited to see how they update a game that has even more potential to be better than RE4 did. Number 1, Turbo Overkill. Turbo Overkill is a masterclass in indie FPS games. In a genre that's very saturated by now with multiple movement shooters, Turbo Overkill comes in, developed by primarily one man, the same man behind the awesome Total Conversion mod for Doom 2, Total Chaos, and shows everyone what an amazing FPS looks like. You play as Johnny Turbo, best described as this guy with a fucking chainsaw for a leg, going around these neon cities soaked in rain, chainsawing dudes with your fucking chainsaw leg, bouncing around the place using some of the most fun weapons I've had the pleasure of using in an FPS. I'll break down some of my favourite weapons. First up are these dual pistols. The primary fire is nothing special, but the alt fire acts like the smart pistol from Titanfall, where it marks the enemies in your vicinity, and then you let go and they just jib immediately. It remains useful from start to finish, and it's a great example of a starting weapon done right. There's a chain gun with a fast firing rate, which is great for putting the pressure on a single target or a crowd, but the alt fire turns it into a flamethrower. There's not much needed to be said, other than a chain gun flamethrower hybrid is just cool as fuck. There's also a sniper rifle that uniquely has an alt fire that lets you teleport into enemies when you shoot them, which telefrags them and lets you get around the place quickly. I dare you to find a single sniper rifle cooler than this. There are shops around the level where you can buy weapon upgrades or new augments that you can equip on yourself Deus Ex style. These don't change the game fundamentally, but give you various buffs, like for example enemies dropping armor when they are killed by your chainsaw leg, which was really useful. Episode 1 is a great time, but the game picks up significantly on episode 2. There's a vehicle level on each episode, and episode 2 lets you drive around on a motorbike, and it's probably one of the coolest levels I've ever played in a game. You can even do a slide while firing the Uzi, and it's not useful at all, but it's cool as shit. The level design goes more from cyberpunk to body horror from this point on, with fleshy tentacles covering a lot of surfaces. The game never fails to impress visually with a lot of detail and generally very gorgeous environment. Episode 3 takes you to the stars, and the game just keeps getting more insane from there. Turbo Overkill kind of follows Doom Eternal's structure closely, but it pulls off more highs than Doom Eternal ever did without ever hitting the same lows, or any lows really. If I had to pick out any negatives, it would really be that episode 1 is very good, but it pales in comparison to episode 2 and 3. And if the biggest weakness your game has is that the first third is just very good, then I'd say you've made a pretty amazing game. Turbo Overkill is my game of the year, and I can't wait to see what the developer does next. This is a game that deserves far more attention than it's actually getting, and I hope I can do at least my part in bringing some of that attention to it. Whew, alright, so this is the first video I've done, and as you can tell, I'm clearly mostly just reading from a script. I think in future videos I will go more for a sort of note system where I can make up my thoughts as I go, which sounds a bit more natural. I'm well aware that this video and my thoughts could have been structured a lot better, something I hope that I can get better with in time. I'm thinking I might want to start doing video reviews on games I enjoy. It might be fun to do. I just want to see what getting into YouTube might be like. You know, my Twitter has enough attention now that I really just wanted to promote cool games rather than just post vibey screenshots every now and then. So I guess I'll see where that all goes. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any critiques or feedback or just want to discuss games from this year, then feel free to DM me or leave a comment. See you later.